Welcome to History to Snooze By, where the past unfolds gently, one story at a time. Tonight, we're heading into the foggy streets of Old New York, a city just beginning to grow. A place lit by gas lamps, shaped by steam and steel, and ruled in the shadows by gangs with names that echoed down narrow alleys. This is the story of the Gilded City's forgotten underworld. A story not just of violence and fear, but of loyalty, survival, and the quiet struggle to belong. From the rough corners of Five Points to the corridors of power in Tammany Hall, you'll hear how the gangs of New York rose from hunger and vanished into memory. But don't worry, you won't need to keep watch tonight. All you have to do is find a comfortable place to rest. Let your shoulders drop. Let the day go quiet. And as we drift back through time together, if you enjoy these calm journeys into the past, please consider subscribing to the channel, leaving a gentle like, or sharing a kind comment below. It helps more people discover our sleepy little corner of history. Now, close your eyes if you'd like, and let the city speak. Chapter 1: The City of Shadows. Before the towers reached the clouds, before the streets hummed with engines and neon lights, New York City was something quieter, but not gentler. In the early years of the 19th century, the city sat on the edge of promise and peril, a growing port town with dreams of greatness, yet creaking under the weight of poverty, disease, and constant change. Cobblestone streets twisted between tall wooden buildings, many leaning ever so slightly from years of uneven growth. Wooden fire escapes clung to crumbling walls, and the faint smell of horse dung, coal smoke, and salt from the harbor drifted through the air. At night, the gas lamps flickered, casting long shadows across doorways that held secrets. This was not yet the city of wealth and steel. This was a city still pulling itself from the mud. And in that fragile place, gangs were born, not out of evil, but out of need. Immigrants arrived daily. Germans, Italians, Irish, Jews, Chinese. Many stepped off boats with nothing but their hands and hope. They came to escape famine, or war, or poverty back home, but quickly found the American streets less golden than promised. Jobs were scarce, rents were high, prejudice was thick. Entire families crammed into a single room with rickety beds, tin pots, and damp floorboards. Some tenements didn't have windows. Others had outhouses shared by dozens. Sickness came easily, and safety did not. For the young, especially young men, there were few options. They could starve, they could beg, or they could fight. Gangs were not always criminal at first. Often they were a strange kind of family. A group of boys from the same alley or the same block who banded together for protection. They gave each other names. They carved out street corners. They watched each other's backs. And slowly, what began as neighborhood pride became something deeper and more dangerous. The city's early police force was weak. There were no radios, no patrol cars, just men in blue coats walking beat after beat, trying to keep the peace with nothing but a club and a whistle. And sometimes those officers were just as desperate as the people they policed. Bribes were common. Favors were traded. Arrest could be bought or avoided if you knew the right person or had the right amount of cash. In this space between law and lawlessness, gangs found their place. Some wore bright red shirts and marched like soldiers. Others carried clubs or bricks and shouted slogans to frighten rivals. They claimed names like the Roach Guards, the 40 Thieves, and the Plug Uglies. Each had a story. Each had a corner of the city they called their own. The heart of this world was a place called 5 Points. At the intersection of Anthony, Cross, Orange, Mulberry, and Little Water Streets, now buried beneath modern Manhattan, 5 Points was once one of the most feared and famous neighborhoods in the world. Imagine crumbling brick buildings leaning against one another, their basements flooding in heavy rain. Piles of ash and mud mixed with garbage in the gutters. Crowds so thick you could barely walk without brushing shoulders. Saloons on every corner. Brothels tucked into the upper floors. Gambling halls lit with candles that never seemed to go out. But the people of 5 Points were not monsters. They were poor, hungry, tired, and often proud. Many had no other home to go to. They lived, worked, and died in these same blocks, with generations stacking one on top of the other. If you were born in 5 Points, you quickly learned how to fight or how to hide. You also learned which gang ruled your street. The earliest of these groups took shape not just around survival, but identity. Irish immigrants pouring in after the Great Famine found themselves hated by many in the city, called lazy, treated as less than white, pushed into the worst jobs and worst homes. So they banded together. They gave themselves fierce names. They carried shillelaghs, thick wooden clubs passed down from Irish tradition, and walked proudly in groups. In time, these Irish street gangs would become some of the most powerful forces in the city. But they were not alone. American-born nativists, the children of earlier settlers, saw the Irish as invaders. They formed gangs of their own, often dressed sharply, speaking loudly, and waving flags to show that they, not the newcomers, belonged. These rivalries were not just fights over turf. They were fights over what it meant to be American. And they turned New York's streets into battlegrounds. Gangs clashed in broad daylight. Fists flew. Clubs cracked bone. Stones shattered glass. Riots would break out that lasted for hours. Sometimes days. The police would arrive late, or not at all. Shopkeepers would board up their windows. Women would drag children into cellars until the shouting faded. One such riot in 1857 between the Dead Rabbits and the Bowery Boys was so large it left dozens injured and required state militia to restore order. It was not just a fight. It was a war within the city. As the decades turned and the city grew, the gangs grew with it. Some became more organized. They wore matching uniforms, held meetings, had ranks and leaders. Others remained more chaotic, packs of teenagers with sharp tongues and quicker fists. But whether large or small, they all fed on the same hunger, a hunger for power, for respect, for control. This hunger also made them useful to others. Political machines like Tammany Hall saw opportunity in these street armies. If you needed votes in a certain district, you could ask a gang to encourage the neighbors to vote the right way. If you needed a rival silenced or a crowd stirred, the right gang could make it happen for a price. And so, gangs didn't just survive, they thrived. They became part of the city's machinery. They influenced elections. They protected illegal businesses. They delivered favors and enforced silence. In some neighborhoods, the gang leader was more powerful than the mayor. Yet for all this chaos, the city kept growing. New York became larger, taller, richer. The harbor filled with more ships. Railways stretched further. Immigrants still came. Italians, Jews, Chinese. Each group finding its own struggles, its own corners of the city to fight for, and eventually, its own gangs. But the early years remained the bloodiest. Before the buildings grew tall enough to block out the sun, before the police found their strength, before crime became business. In these first chapters, the gangs of New York were raw. They were hungry. They were proud. And they were deeply human. They were not just villains, but sons and brothers. Men with dreams that had no place to grow. They shaped their world with fists and fear. And in doing so, they shaped the city itself. This is their story. A story of shadows and light, of fists and favors, of loyalty and loss. It begins here, in a place that no longer exists, in the 5 Points where the old streets met, where a boy could become a soldier without ever leaving his block, where the city dreamed of greatness, but woke to the sound of gang cries in the night, where the story of New York's underworld began, quietly, fiercely, and in the dark. Chapter 2, The 5 Points. There was a time when the name 5 Points could quiet a room. It did not matter whether you were a banker on Broadway, a dock worker on the East River, or a preacher standing on a crate in the Bowery. Everyone knew that name, and everyone understood what it meant. 5 Points was not simply a neighborhood. It was a symbol, a warning, a wound in the side of New York City that would not close. To walk its streets was to see both the worst of poverty and the stubborn will of people who refused to disappear. It was loud and dirty, packed with bodies and smells and stories. It was where the gangs began. But more than that, it was where they learned how to survive. The neighborhood was named for its unique street layout. 5 roads, Anthony, Cross, Orange, Mulberry, and Little Water, met at odd angles to form 5 sharp corners. From above, it looked like a broken star. On the ground, it felt like a maze. Buildings leaned toward the streets, their bricks crumbling, their balconies sagging under the weight of laundry and time. Wooden stairs creaked with every step, and thin walls carried every argument, every baby's cry, every knock at the door. Most families lived in rooms no bigger than a modern kitchen. A single oil lamp might light the space where 8 or 10 people slept. Rats were common, so were lice, and the air never quite lost the scent of ash, sweat, and rotting waste. During heavy rains, the streets turned into rivers. Raw sewage mixed with horse dung flowed into doorways. Plagues visited often: cholera, typhoid, tuberculosis. But still, people came. 5 Points offered what few places could: a home, however harsh, for those who had none. The Irish came in waves after the famine, their hunger not just for food, but for a new beginning. Italians followed. So did Germans and African Americans, each group carving out space in a city that was never quite ready to welcome them. Inside the Points, cultures mixed in ways unseen elsewhere in the city. Black and Irish children played in the alleys. Italian shopkeepers sold bread to German mothers. It was crowded and tense, but also alive with music and language and stubborn joy. It was a place where, despite everything, people laughed, danced, fell in love, and fought. Always there were fights. The gangs that ruled 5 Points were born from that tension, born from the need to protect, to belong, to strike back. They had names that echoed through the streets: the Dead Rabbits, the Roach Guards, the Shirt Tails, the Wyos. Some wore special colors or symbols on their jackets. Others marched in groups through the narrow lanes, daring rivals to cross their path. Each block had its own allegiance. A boy growing up on Mulberry Street knew exactly who to trust and who to avoid. It was not written on signs. It was written in glances, in the tilt of a cap, in the way someone tied their boots. Outsiders might not see it, but those who lived there could read the streets like a book. Fights between gangs were not always deadly, but they were rarely clean. Wooden clubs, iron bars, stones, and fists did most of the work. Sometimes blades. On rare nights, gunfire echoed down the alleys, sharp and frightening. But most battles were brutal in their simplicity: a quick ambush, a long chase, and a bruised boy left bleeding in the mud. Despite the violence, the gangs offered something few institutions could: identity. In a city that often ignored them, the gang made a boy feel seen, important. They were not just thugs. They were messengers, protectors, sometimes even heroes within their own streets. They delivered food to widows, collected debts, settled disputes. Some handed out firewood in winter or paid for a neighbor's rent with the money they'd earned, however they'd earned it. Still, 5 Points drew more attention for its danger than its kindness. Writers and reformers from wealthier parts of the city came to visit, sometimes in groups, sometimes with police escorts. They walked through the narrow lanes like explorers in a foreign land. They took notes, drew sketches, published articles filled with fear and disgust. They called 5 Points a den of sin, a nest of vice, a sinkhole of filth. They wrote of barefoot children, drunken mothers, and street boys with broken teeth and burning eyes. And while some of it was true, much of it missed the point. The people of 5 Points were not criminals by birth. They were poor, forgotten, pressed into corners by a city that grew richer every year but left many behind. The gangs were not causes of the city's problems. They were symptoms. And in many ways, they were trying to build their own kind of order. Inside the 5 Points, certain gangs ran their own courts. If a man beat his wife, he might be dragged before a group of older gang members and forced to pay or leave. If a shopkeeper was robbed, the gang might return the goods, especially if that shopkeeper paid for protection. It was a crude kind of justice, but in a city where police were few and often corrupt, it was sometimes the only kind. Music was another force that shaped the neighborhood. At night, the sound of fiddles and accordions drifted from saloons and dance halls. Irish jigs mixed with African rhythms. German waltzes met Italian folk songs. Dancers moved with joy and desperation, their feet pounding against wooden floors as if to forget the cold just outside. There were theaters, too. Small, smoky spaces where actors performed wild comedies, serious dramas, or strange shows where half the cast wore gang colors. Some performances mocked the city's wealthy. Others celebrated the toughness of 5 Points life. And when the curtain fell, the crowd would cheer not just for the story, but for the feeling of being seen. Food was sold on street corners. Hot corn, roast peanuts, pickled eggs, cheap stews. Vendors called out in a dozen accents, their voices blending into a strange, steady hum that carried through the blocks like a lullaby. Churches stood among the saloons. Some offered soup kitchens. Others ran schools for poor children, trying to give them a path away from the gangs. A few succeeded. Most did not. Still, the effort mattered. It meant someone cared. And sometimes that was enough to spark a change. One of the most famous spots in 5 Points was the Old Brewery. It had once been a real brewery, a place where beer was made. But after it closed, it was converted into a kind of tenement. A dark, sprawling building with rooms cut from its former vats and storage spaces. At one point, more than 1,000 people lived there. The hallways were damp, the air stale. But it was a place to sleep. And that was enough for many. Rumors swirled around the old brewery. Stories of ghosts, of secret rooms, of murders and disappearances. Some said it had seen a death every night for years. Others called it the most dangerous address in New York. Whether the rumors were true or not, the building stood as a symbol of 5 Points itself. Old, broken, crowded, feared, and alive. Over time, the city tried to clean up the neighborhood. Reformers built new housing. Police raided known gang hideouts. Churches held rallies. Newspapers ran editorials calling for change. And slowly, the landscape began to shift. The worst tenements were demolished. Streets were renamed. Parks were planted where saloons once stood. Some gang leaders were arrested. Others grew old and faded away. But the memory of 5 Points did not vanish. It lingered in stories and photographs, in the very bones of the city. Even now, beneath the concrete and glass of modern Manhattan, the ghost of 5 Points remains. Buried deep, but not forgotten. It shaped what came next, the rise of new gangs, the birth of organized crime, the uneasy dance between power and poverty. For those who lived it, the neighborhood was more than a slum. It was a world of struggle, of song, of blood and belonging, a world that gave rise to the legends still to come. Chapter 3: The Dead Rabbits and the Bowery Boys. There are some names that settle into the bones of a city, not because of their elegance or their power, but because they echo, because they carry with them the weight of noise, of movement, of time. The Dead Rabbits and the Bowery Boys were names like that. To the people of mid-19th century New York, those two names were more than symbols. They were warnings. They marked a line drawn in the dirt between neighborhoods, between beliefs, between people trying to survive in different ways. The Dead Rabbits were mostly Irish, young men who had grown up in the 5 Points or nearby wards. Most had known hunger, sickness, and scorn before they knew anything else. Their hands were calloused from work when they could find it. Their eyes held the quiet of boys who had seen too much too soon. They wore scraps of red cloth tied around their hats or sleeves. It was not a uniform, exactly, but it said who they were. It told others what side they stood on. Their rivals, the Bowery Boys, were just as fierce, but different in almost every way. They were born from older American families, many of them Protestant, many proud of their roots in the city. They worked as butchers, printers, carpenters. Their clothes were cleaner, their accent sharper, their stance bolder. They prided themselves on order and strength. Some wore tall stovepipe hats, almost like performers, and carried clubs carved with their names. They saw themselves as protectors of a certain kind of New York. The New York without the Irish, without the poor, without the change that scared them. The tension between the two gangs was not just about streets. It was about identity. To the Dead Rabbits, the Bowery Boys were bullies. To the Bowery Boys, the Rabbits were invaders. And so, the fights began. Some were small. A punch outside a saloon, a shouted insult from across the street. But others grew large, loud, destructive. One fight might start with a boy knocked down near Paradise Square. Another might begin when a Bowery boy crossed Canal Street at the wrong hour. But once it began, word would spread quickly. The air would change. Windows would slam shut. Mothers would call their children indoors. Doors were bolted. Candles snuffed out. Then the streets would fill. Dozens, sometimes hundreds, of young men would pour into the square. Many carried sticks. Some brought bricks or broken bottles. A few, hidden in the back, carried pistols or knives. Their feet pounded the cobblestones. Their voices rose in chants and curses. It was not quiet. It was not organized. But it was fierce. The city's small police force often stood helpless. In one infamous riot in 1857, known simply as the Dead Rabbits Riot, the gangs fought for 2 straight days. Over 1,000 men took part. Some reports said more. The fighting spilled from alley to alley, from square to saloon. Bricks shattered windows. Clubs cracked skulls. Firearms flashed from behind barrels and doors. People screamed. Horses reared. Shops were looted. Homes ransacked. The air filled with smoke and fear. The police arrived late, as they often did, and found themselves outnumbered. Some officers joined in the fighting, not to stop it, but to protect friends or settle scores. Others simply tried to stay alive. Eventually, the city called in the state militia. Soldiers arrived with bayonets fixed and rifles loaded. Only then did the crowd begin to scatter. Only then did the chaos give way to silence. The aftermath left scars. Some said at least 8 people died. Others believed the number was higher. Dozens were wounded. Some never recovered. Buildings were burned, streets stained. But perhaps the deepest wound was not the broken glass or the bleeding heads. It was the understanding that this city, for all its hopes and dreams, was still deeply divided. And yet, both gangs kept growing. The Dead Rabbits were not just fighters. They were part of a larger struggle. Many Irish immigrants saw them as protectors. They defended their neighborhoods. They chased off rent collectors. They fought back against unfair employers. They gave boys a place to belong when the world gave them nothing else. They also took part in politics. Tammany Hall, the great political machine of New York, saw the value in these street gangs. The Dead Rabbits could get out the vote, sometimes through persuasion, sometimes through force. They could stuff ballot boxes. They could guard polling stations. In return, they received protection, money, and jobs. It was not honest, but it was effective, and it made the Rabbits powerful. The Bowery boys had their own influence. They were favored by many in the business class, shop owners, landlords, and others who feared the rise of the immigrant poor. Their style was cleaner, their speech more refined, but their fists were just as quick. They too had ties to politics and often worked with rival parties to Tammany Hall. They viewed themselves as guardians of the city's future, even as they beat their enemies with clubs and boots. Both gangs patrolled their territories as if they were armies. They kept watch from rooftops. They controlled who entered certain saloons, who crossed certain corners. They held parades, loud, crowded marches with flags and music and sometimes violence. They even held funerals for fallen members, complete with long processions, floral arrangements, and gang colors draped over caskets. For the people who lived in those neighborhoods, the gangs were both danger and protection. A shopkeeper who paid his dues could expect his storefront to be safe. A woman whose brother was in the gang might be left alone by troublemakers. But those who refused to cooperate, who spoke against the gang, or crossed its members, could find themselves in a dark alley or worse. Even so, the lines were not always clear. There were friendships that crossed gang boundaries. There were secret meetings. There were shared loves and shared losses. Life in the city was too messy for clean divisions. People adapted. They survived. And yet, the rivalry between the Dead Rabbits and the Bowery boys defined an era. Newspapers wrote about them with equal parts horror and fascination. Cartoonists drew them as animals, wild, snarling, dirty. Ministers preached against them. Mothers warned their children to stay away. But behind the stories were real people, young men who carried scars on their hands and memories in their hearts. Some would grow old and leave the life behind. Others would die in it. By the 1860s, change was coming. The Civil War would take many young men from the streets, some willingly, others dragged into service by force. The draft riots would shake the city again, and new kinds of violence would rise. But the stories of the Dead Rabbits and the Bowery boys would remain. They became part of the city's memory, their names scratched into walls, whispered in alleyways, passed down in family stories. In time, books would be written. Films would be made. Tour guides would point to the corners where gang fights once raged, and some would wonder if it had all been real, if young men had truly turned city blocks into battlefields. But it was real. It was blood and dust and pride. It was fear and hunger and fierce belonging. It was New York, learning what kind of city it would be. And in that learning, the gangs wrote their own chapter, a loud one, a violent one, but also a human one. Chapter 4, Bill the Butcher. Long before his name reached the pages of novels and film scripts, William Poole was already a legend in the streets that shaped him. To some, he was a hero, a defender of native-born workers, a man who stood tall when others bent. To others, he was a brute, a figure of violence and hate. But in every telling, he left a mark, and that mark never quite faded. William Poole was born in 1821 in Sussex County, New Jersey. His father was a butcher, and William followed in his footsteps, eventually opening a shop of his own in Manhattan. It was honest work, the kind that left your hands red, your apron stained, your back sore from long hours. But William was not only a tradesman, he was a fighter. He was tall and broad. His face was square, his jaw strong. People said his eyes could hold a stare longer than most men could hold their breath. He walked with the calm of someone unafraid to be tested. And in New York, especially during the years of gang unrest, that kind of presence meant something. William Poole became known as Bill the Butcher, not just for his trade, but for his skill with fists, knives, and clubs. He aligned himself with the Bowery boys, standing firmly in the growing tide of nativist belief, a movement that saw Irish immigrants as a threat to American identity and labor. Poole believed deeply in protecting what he called American values. He wore that belief like armor, but his version of patriotism was not soft or welcoming. It was loud. It was angry. It was rooted in a fear that the old ways of the city were being pushed out by newcomers who looked different, spoke differently, prayed differently. He was a member of the Know Nothing Party, a political group that wanted to stop immigration, especially from Ireland and Catholic countries. They believed the United States should belong to those born on its soil, and they fought to keep it that way, with words, with laws, and often with violence. In the streets, Bill the Butcher became a symbol. He led marches. He made speeches. He walked the Bowery with his supporters, demanding that his view of the city be respected. But he was not just a figurehead. He fought, often. And when he did, it was brutal. Stories of his brawls filled newspapers. Some were exaggerations. Others were not. He was known to face off against multiple men and come out standing. He carried a large Bowie knife, which he kept sharp. He believed in direct answers and swift consequences. To many of the city's poor Irish immigrants, he was a monster, a man who used his power to intimidate, to bully, to hurt. To others, especially those who feared the rapid changes sweeping through New York, he was a necessary force, a protector of tradition. Like most men of that era, Poole's public image was complicated. He could be generous to friends, offering work or protection. He could also be cruel to those he saw as enemies. He lived by a strict code, but that code was his own. His rivalry with John Morrissey, an Irish-American prizefighter and political figure, would become the beginning of his end. Morrissey was younger, bold, and rising in power. He had the backing of Tammany Hall, the city's powerful democratic political machine, and was gaining influence among the Irish working class. Where Poole saw danger, Morrissey saw opportunity. The two men represented different futures for the city, and neither was willing to back down. Their conflict became personal. Words turned to threats. Threats turned to plans. On a cold February night in 1855, Bill the Butcher was drinking at Stanwix Hall, a tavern near the corner of Broadway and Prince Street. The room was warm with candlelight. The air smelled of smoke and old beer. Men gathered at tables, playing cards, telling stories, nursing bruises from earlier fights. John Morrissey wasn't there, but his allies were. Among them was Louis Baker, unknown associate. Words were exchanged. Tensions rose. And then, in a sudden flash, a pistol was drawn. Bill the Butcher was shot in the chest. He did not die immediately. They said he stood after the shot, staggered a few steps, and cursed the man who had pulled the trigger. They carried him away, and he clung to life for nearly 2 weeks. He was 33 years old when he finally passed. His death shook the city. Crowds gathered at his funeral. Thousands came to pay respects, whether in admiration or curiosity. His coffin was draped in the American flag. The procession stretched for blocks. Some came to mourn the man. Others came to witness the end of a chapter. Even those who hated his beliefs could not ignore the impact he had left. Bill the Butcher did not build schools or open hospitals. He did not write books or hold office. But he helped shape a time in New York when the streets were ruled not by law, but by presence. When the sound of boots on cobblestone could mean everything. When belief, for better or worse, was held tight like a weapon. In the years after his death, the city continued to grow. The gangs continued to fight. But something had changed. Bill's story reminded everyone that power was fragile, that even the strongest fists could be silenced, that the line between legend and man was thinner than it seemed. The Bowery boys carried on for a time, but the sharp identity that had once defined them began to fade. The city was changing too fast. New waves of immigrants arrived. New political deals were made. And the old rules, where strength alone could control a neighborhood, were slowly breaking. But the name remained. People still spoke of Bill the Butcher in whispers and warnings, in memories. He had become a symbol of defiance, of fear, of a city struggling to define itself. And though his world would not last forever, the story of William Poole would echo far beyond the taverns and streets where he once stood. Chapter 5: Tammany Hall's Web. In the heart of New York, not far from the dusty streets of Five Points or the loud taverns of the Bowery, there stood buildings that looked more polished. Their windows were cleaner, their doors heavier, their signs carved in smooth stone. Inside, the floors creaked less. The rooms smelled of ink and paper, not sweat and smoke. But power flowed through these halls just as surely as it did through the alleys where gangs ruled. This was Tammany Hall, the political machine that would shape New York for decades. It began in the late 1700s, originally as a social club named after a Native American chief. But by the 19th century, it had become something more. Tammany was not just a name. It was a system. A way of keeping control in a city that grew faster than anyone could follow. New York was a place of constant change. Immigrants arrived by the thousands. Entire neighborhoods appeared in a matter of months. Streets shifted. Languages multiplied. Churches and tenements rose side by side. In all this movement, people needed help. They needed food, jobs, a place to sleep. They needed someone to explain how the city worked, or at least how to survive in it. Tammany Hall offered that help, but it came with a cost. The men of Tammany were not elected in the usual way. They were chosen through favors, loyalty, and quiet agreements. At the local level, each ward of the city had a leader, called a ward boss. These bosses knew every family in their district. They knew who had just arrived from Ireland, who was out of work, who needed coal for the winter. They kept track of every birth, every arrest, every sickness. Their memory was long. Their reach was wide. If a man needed a job, the boss could find him one. If a widow needed bread, the boss could have it sent to her door. If a boy was in trouble with the police, the boss might speak to the right person and make it go away. But in return, the people owed something, their vote. On election day, the boss expected support. Sometimes he asked, sometimes he didn't. Gangs often played a role in this part of the system. A strong gang could make sure votes were cast the right way or keep others from voting at all. Ballot boxes might be stuffed. Opponents might be threatened. And if needed, a riot could remind the city who was really in charge. It was not clean. It was not fair. But to many, it felt like the only option. The city government often ignored the needs of the poor. Hospitals were full. Schools were scarce. Police were underpaid and easily swayed. Tammany filled the gaps. It fed the hungry, clothed the cold, and gave newcomers a foothold. People remembered that. It wasn't just politics, it was survival. And so, gang leaders and Tammany men began to speak the same language. In neighborhoods like 5 Points, the Dead Rabbits and similar groups worked hand in hand with ward bosses. They served as enforcers, bodyguards, messengers, and, when the time came, voters. A gang could deliver hundreds of ballots in a single day, all marked the same. That kind of power could win elections, and Tammany paid for it. Sometimes in cash, sometimes in protection. A gang member arrested for theft or assault might be released the next morning with no charges. A saloon owner who paid his dues to the right boss could run his business with few questions asked. Even brothels and gambling halls, technically illegal, were often left alone, as long as they remained loyal to the right side. One man rose above the rest in this world of quiet deals and backroom agreements. His name was William M. Tweed. Most knew him simply as Boss Tweed. He was large in body and presence. He wore thick suits, his pockets full of cigars and papers. He smiled often, shook hands with strength, and spoke in a tone that was both friendly and firm. Tweed understood that true power did not come from titles or speeches. It came from favors, from loyalty, from knowing who needed what and when. Under his leadership, Tammany Hall reached heights and depths never seen before. Tweed and his circle stole millions from the city through inflated contracts and fake expenses. A courthouse might be built for twice its real cost, with the extra money flowing back to Tammany allies. A street might be paved and repaved, the funds divided among those who approved the job. Yet, at the same time, Tweed built schools, hospitals, and orphanages. He made sure that newly arrived immigrants had a place to sleep, food to eat, and papers to find work. He attended weddings and funerals. He sent gifts to families in need. To some, he was a thief. To others, a hero. And once again, the gangs played their part in this network. They kept order at rallies. They disrupted opposition meetings. They helped manage the crowds during parades and protests. If someone caused trouble, the gang knew how to make them quiet. Some gang leaders gained political positions themselves. They were appointed to city jobs, often with generous pay and little actual work. A saloon owner might suddenly be named a sanitation inspector. A known thief might become a fire marshal. These roles were rewards for loyalty, not skill. But as with all systems built on silence, cracks began to appear. Reformers, journalists, and rival politicians began to push back. They published stories, drew cartoons, held hearings. They spoke of stolen money, of bought votes, of the hidden web that controlled the city. And slowly, public opinion began to shift. In 1871, Boss Tweed was finally arrested. His trial became a sensation. The evidence was overwhelming. He was found guilty and sent to prison, though he escaped once before being returned. He died in jail in 1878. His fall shook Tammany Hall, but it did not destroy it. The machine lived on, quieter but still strong. It adapted, changed faces, changed methods, but its roots were deep. And so too were the connections between politics and the underworld. 4 years after, gangs continued to serve as tools for those in power. Their strength was useful, their presence a reminder. Even as the city moved toward more formal systems of law and order, the old networks remained. For many, the dream of New York was still out of reach. And in that gap between hope and reality, Tammany offered a hand. Sometimes it lifted people up. Sometimes it closed around their throat. But always it reminded the city of a simple truth. Power does not always wear a uniform. Sometimes it wears a smile. Sometimes it walks in silence. Sometimes it waits at the edge of a crowded street, watching, listening, remembering who owes what, and when the time will come to collect. Chapter 6: Crime and Community. When people speak of gangs, they often think only of violence, of knives and fists, of smoke in alleyways and blood on cobblestones. But in the New York of the 19th century, crime lived side by side with daily life. And the men who broke laws were often the same ones who helped neighbors carry coal in the winter, or made sure a child had food when there was none at home. This was not a world of black and white. It was a world of gray. In neighborhoods like 5 Points, where poverty reached into every window and hunger knocked on every door, the idea of crime was complicated. Stealing a loaf of bread was not the same as robbery with a pistol. Gambling in the back of a saloon was not viewed the same as breaking into a home. There was a kind of understanding, an unspoken rule among the people who lived there. You did what you had to do. Wages were low when there were wages at all. A strong back could earn a few coins unloading crates at the docks. A nimble hand might make more in a night lifting purses from distracted pockets. For many, the question was not whether to bend the rules. It was how far and how often. Gangs offered more than just muscle. They offered a sense of belonging, a kind of identity that gave structure to otherwise difficult lives. Being part of a gang meant you had people who would speak for you, who would defend you, who would remember your name. That kind of loyalty had weight. Inside the gang, there was hierarchy. Some members were enforcers, quick with fists, always near the front of a crowd. Others were scouts, eyes and ears in taverns and on corners. Some ran errands. Some carried messages. And some, though never seen in a fight, held quiet power through their ties to politicians or businessmen. And even outside their formal ranks, gangs could act as a kind of neighborhood council. If a landlord raised rents too high, he might find his windows broken the next morning. If a shopkeeper treated his customers with disrespect, word would spread, and that word could lead to trouble. Gangs enforced their own form of justice, often swift and unkind, but sometimes effective in ways the city's officials were not. In some cases, they protected their streets from worse dangers. Rival gangs often looked for weakness. A block with no defenders might be looted or burned. A girl walking home alone could be targeted. But if her brother was known to belong to the local gang, others might think twice. That sense of safety, however rough, mattered to families who had little else. It was not uncommon for gang members to attend local church services, standing at the back in worn coats, heads bowed. They joined in parades on feast days. They sat with neighbors during funerals. They were part of the fabric of the community, even as they pulled at its threads. Gangs also had their own codes. Stealing from a neighbor might bring more punishment than stealing from a stranger. Hurting a child was seen as unforgivable. Informing to the police was considered a betrayal worse than any crime. These rules were not written down, but they were known, and they were followed. Still, the balance between crime and community was always uneasy. Some residents saw the gangs as nothing more than bullies. They resented the constant threat of violence, the noise, the fear. They longed for peace, for clean streets and quiet nights. They dreamed of a city where power did not come from how hard a man could hit or how many friends he had in a tavern. Others, though, saw the gangs as a necessary part of life. Not ideal, but real. Something to be worked with, not wished away. In time, some gang leaders began to take on the role of local guardians more formally. They helped organize fire brigades. They settled disputes before they reached the courts. They gave small loans to shopkeepers. They handed out meals during holidays. In this way, they blurred the line between outlaw and neighbor. In fact, the most powerful gangs often controlled local charities. A man who gave a coin to a church collection plate on Sunday might have earned that coin through a dice game the night before. A boy who received shoes from a relief fund might later be seen running errands for the men who ran the corner saloon. The web of connections was tight. It held everyone in its threads, whether they liked it or not. There were stories of gang members rescuing orphans from the street or paying for a doctor when a neighbor fell ill. These acts were not always pure. Sometimes they were done to build loyalty, but sometimes they were done simply because the men remembered what it felt like to be hungry or cold or alone. The saloons were central to this world. More than places to drink, there were places to gather, to talk, to make plans. A gang's favorite saloon might be its unofficial headquarters. Behind the bar, names were remembered. Debts were tracked. Messages were passed. A corner table might host a quiet meeting between a gang leader and a ward politician, discussing how best to manage the coming election. On some nights, music filled the air. The sounds of a fiddle, or a piano, or a voice rough with drink but steady with feeling. Laughter rose over the clink of glasses. For a few hours, the weight of the world lifted. And in those hours, the community felt whole. The women of these neighborhoods played their part too. Some were wives or sisters of gang members, trying to hold families together in the face of uncertainty. Others ran boarding houses or food stands. Some found work as dancers, singers, or laundry workers. And a few, though rarely named in history books, held quiet influence within the gangs themselves. Their advice was trusted, their warnings heeded. Children watched all of this with wide eyes. Some would grow up and choose a different path. They would leave the neighborhood, find steady work, build quiet lives. Others would stay. They would remember the men who stood tall on corners, the ones who tipped their hats, who gave them a coin on a cold morning, who taught them how to hold their ground. And so the cycle continued. Crime and community, bound together by need, by habit, by the strange comfort of familiarity. It was not a perfect world. It was not a safe one. But it was a world shaped by those who lived in it. And in that world, gangs were not just a threat. They were a presence, a force, a reflection of what the city had become and what it might still be. The people of those neighborhoods knew their streets. They knew their neighbors. They knew the risks. But they also knew something else. They knew that sometimes, when no one else would come, it was the man with the rough hands and the quiet nod who showed up at the door. And for that, they remembered. Chapter 7, Monk Eastman's Kingdom. There are moments in a city's story when one person steps forward, not from a palace or a courtroom, but from a street corner, carrying with them the shape of a new era. For New York's gangs at the turn of the 20th century, that person was Monk Eastman. His name, like many legends, was a little misleading. He wasn't a monk, and Eastman wasn't even his real last name. He was born Edward Osterman around 1875, most likely in Williamsburg, Brooklyn, to a working-class Jewish family. Some said his father owned a drugstore. Others said little about his family at all. What mattered to the city was not where he came from, but what he became. Monk was a large man, broad-shouldered, barrel-chested, with thick hands and a nose that had been broken more than once. He walked with the slow, heavy gait of someone who expected others to move out of the way. His clothes were often plain, but his presence filled any room he entered. He did not speak much in public, but when he did, people listened. Unlike the gangs of earlier decades, groups formed from neighborhoods, from ethnic pride, from survival. Monk Eastman built something more organized. He was not content to be a local figure. He wanted territory, influence, and most of all, respect. At his peak, Eastman controlled over 1,000 men. They were boxers, pickpockets, thieves, bouncers, and former street kids who had grown into muscle. Many were Jewish, like Eastman. Others were Irish or Italian or simply loyal. What bound them together was not heritage, but purpose. Under Eastman's leadership, they formed a true gang in the modern sense, structured, disciplined, and willing to do whatever was needed to protect their name. Their headquarters moved with the times. No longer the dusty back rooms of saloons, Eastman's men operated from cafes, pool halls, and clubs. They maintained stables for their pigeons, Monk had a fondness for birds, and kept a network of safe houses across the Lower East Side. Their work was varied. Some guarded shipments from the docks to nearby warehouses. Others controlled betting at horse tracks or rigged card games. Many were hired out as muscle for political rallies, labor disputes, or private revenge. If someone needed a show of force, Monk's men could be there within hours. Dressed in coats, flat caps pulled low, they carried clubs, brass knuckles, and sometimes small pistols tucked beneath their belts. They were known not just for violence, but for discipline. Unlike earlier gangs, who often fought without a plan, the Eastman gang moved with intention. Their fights were coordinated, their targets chosen, their profits managed carefully. Monk understood that reputation was a tool, but only when used wisely. The politicians knew him. The police feared him. The public whispered his name. But his rise also brought rivals. Across town, another gang was growing, led by an ambitious Italian-American named Paul Kelly. His gang, composed of slick dressers and former boxers, came from a different world. Where Eastman's men were rough and direct, Kelly's crew favored manners and strategy. The tension between them simmered for years. Eventually, it boiled over. The conflict between Eastman and Kelly's 5 Points gang became one of the bloodiest gang wars in New York's history. It was not a single event, but a long, bitter struggle played out across alleyways and rooftops, theaters and saloons. Shootings became common. Innocents were sometimes caught in the crossfire, and both gangs dug deeper into the city's power structure, trying to outmaneuver each other not just with fists, but with connections. Still, Eastman held firm. He remained visible in his neighborhood, walking the streets with his pigeons, nodding to shopkeepers, slipping coins to children, speaking to his men in a calm, gravelly voice. He was feared, but also respected. People understood that he enforced a kind of order, one that might be harsh, but was better than the chaos that came before. But no king rules forever. As the years passed, the police began to push harder against organized crime. New leaders rose. Old allies faded. And Monk, so long the center of his world, began to lose ground. In 1904, after a street fight that left a man shot, Monk Eastman was arrested and sent to prison. Without him, the gang splintered. Some joined the 5 Points. Others went off on their own. The Eastman Empire began to crumble. When he was released, Monk found a city that had changed. The old neighborhoods were shifting. New immigrants had arrived. New gangs had formed, more focused on business than territory. Prohibition was on the horizon. The underworld was preparing for a new kind of criminal, one who dressed in silk, carried a ledger, and built empires not with clubs, but with deals. Still, Monk tried to find his place. In a surprising turn, he enlisted in the army during World War I. Too old by most standards, he managed to sign up anyway, using a different name. He served with distinction in France, earning praise for bravery. For a time, the headlines remembered him not as a gang leader, but as a soldier. When he returned to New York, however, the streets no longer belonged to him. He worked briefly as a bodyguard. He visited old haunts, but the city had moved on. In 1920, Monk Eastman was shot and killed on a quiet street corner, not far from where he had once ruled. He was 45 years old. His funeral drew a modest crowd, a few old friends, a few strangers who remembered the stories, and then silence. But in the deep story of New York, his chapter remains. He was a bridge between the old gangs and the new, between the days of bricks and clubs and the coming age of syndicates and suits. He showed that strength could be organized, that crime could become a business, that a boy from the back streets could for a time shape the fate of a city. He was not gentle, he was not kind, but he was clear. He stood for something. And for those who lived in the world he built, that meant something too. The pigeons still flew in the skies above the Lower East Side. And somewhere, in the hush between footsteps on worn pavement, the city remembered. Chapter 8. Paul Kelly and the 5 Points Gang. While Monk Eastman ruled with force and presence, the man who would challenge his legacy brought something different: elegance, patience, and an understanding that power could wear a suit. His name was Paul Kelly. He was not born with that name. His birth name was Paolo Antonio Vaccarelli, the son of Italian immigrants. He grew up in the tenements of the Lower East Side, surrounded by noise, hard work, and the heavy weight of expectation. The streets where he played as a boy were narrow, uneven, and always full. In that world, strength mattered, but so did wit. As a young man, he made a name for himself as a prizefighter. Quick on his feet and sharp with his fists, he won matches, respect, and just enough attention to move into a new role, one that would shape his life. He changed his name from Paolo to Paul, adding a smoother edge to better blend into American society. He dressed well, spoke softly, and moved through the world like a man who knew what he wanted. Paul Kelly saw the city not just as a battlefield, but as a board, a place where influence could be traded, where favors could grow like money in a bank. He created the 5 Points Gang, named for the neighborhood that had once been the epicenter of New York's roughest streets. But unlike the gangs of the past, Kelly's organization was not built on chaos. It was built on strategy. He gathered men who could fight, yes, but he also brought in men who could think. Bookkeepers, gamblers, barkeepers, and thieves who understood their trades. He created layers of command, sections of responsibility. The gang functioned almost like a business, with rules, goals, and long-term planning. They ran protection rackets, collecting payments from local shops in exchange for safety. They managed gambling houses, brothels, and betting operations. Their fingers reached into politics, labor unions, and even the police. Kelly understood that force could open a door, but respect and money could keep it open. He opened a social club on Great Jones Street. It had polished wood floors, brass fittings, and private rooms for meetings. To outsiders, it looked like a gentleman's club. But inside, deals were made. Alliances were formed. Enemies were discussed. The air was thick with cigar smoke and quiet decisions. Kelly was rarely loud. He did not walk the streets with pigeons or lead mobs with bricks. Instead, he sat at tables, folded his hands, and listened. He watched. He waited. And when he spoke, people leaned in. Under his leadership, the 5 Points Gang grew quickly. They absorbed smaller gangs, offered deals to rivals, and filled the vacuum left by the decline of Monk Eastman. They operated across neighborhoods, stretching their influence from the docks to the theater district, from the alleys of Chinatown to the quieter lanes of Uptown. It was not just muscle, it was a network. And among those who worked for Kelly were names that would one day echo across American history. Johnny Torrio, Al Capone. Men who would later build empires in Chicago and beyond began here, learning the rules of the underworld from a quiet man in a press suit on Great Jones Street. Kelly taught them discipline. He taught them when to wait, when to move, and when to vanish. He showed that crime did not need to be noisy to be effective. That fear could live behind a closed door and a well-written letter just as easily as behind a clenched fist. But as always, power brings trouble. The war between the 5 Points and Monk Eastman's gang simmered for years, bursting into fights in the streets, gunfire in alleyways, and brawls that left broken bodies in their wake. Police tried to contain it, but many officers were paid to look the other way. Others were too afraid. Eventually, the violence drew too much attention. In a rare move, political leaders and police commanders met and agreed something had to be done. Both Kelly and Eastman were pressured to end the fighting. Arrests followed. Meetings were broken up. Support from politicians grew weaker. Kelly responded by pulling back from street violence. He tightened his operations, drew less attention, and focused more on the long game: politics, unions, legal fronts. He began to fade from the public eye, retreating into the quiet of his office, still influential, but less visible. Some say he was forced out. Others say he chose to leave before it all collapsed. In truth, Paul Kelly saw the future coming. The city was changing. Prohibition was just over the horizon. A new wave of organized crime was forming, more secretive, more structured, more national in scale. The old street gangs were fit. The new bosses would not wear gang colors or fight in the open. They would wear suits, sit in private restaurants, and speak through lawyers. But the roots of that change lived in Kelly's gang. He had shown that a gang could be more than a group of young men with fists and anger. It could be a machine, a system, a shadow version of the city itself, with its own rules, its own order, its own quiet reach. And for a time, he had ruled it. The 5 Points gang did not end in a single night. It drifted, changed shape, became something else. Its name faded, but its lessons lived on in the minds of those who followed, and in the shape of organized crime for decades to come. Paul Kelly slipped into history with fewer headlines than others. There was no grand trial, no dramatic fall. He walked away quietly, just as he had risen. And the city, always changing, kept moving. But in the quiet corners, in the hidden rooms, in the faces of those who remembered, his story remained. He had taken a name once feared and turned it into a brand. He had turned crime into structure. And he had shown that sometimes the most dangerous man in the room is not the one holding a weapon, but the one who never raises his voice. Chapter 9: Vice and Protection. Every city has its surface. The bright lights, the busy shops, the crowded sidewalks where life unfolds in plain view. But beneath that surface, often just a doorway, another world quietly works. In old New York, that world was built on vice, and its steady heartbeat was the promise of protection. The city, by the early 20th century, had grown tall and restless. Electric lights began to replace gas lamps. Streetcars rattled through neighborhoods. Men in hats and coats moved through the streets with purpose, while the alleys and back rooms still held the old ways. And in those shadows, opportunity waited for anyone willing to claim it. Vice, in those years, meant more than wrongdoing. It meant desire, controlled and sold. It meant things people sought after in secret. Liquor served after hours. Dice rolled in smoky basements. Cards dealt in silence beneath flickering lights. Women standing at corners, offering more than conversation. And all of it required a kind of order. That order came not from the city's laws, but from the men who enforced a different kind of rule. Gangsters, loan sharks, lookouts, and enforcers all worked together in a system that was part tradition, part business. Everyone had a role. Everyone earned their piece. Protection was the name most often given to this arrangement. It sounded simple. A butcher might pay $5 a week to keep his windows unbroken. A club owner might hand over $20 to ensure the police didn't visit too often. A brothel might send money each month in exchange for silence and safety. But protection meant more than avoiding trouble. In many cases, it meant staying open, surviving. A man who paid his dues might find unexpected benefits. His deliveries would arrive safely. His competitors would face setbacks. His name might carry a little more weight. These were the quiet favors that made this system run. At the center of it all were the men who made the rounds, collecting payments, settling arguments, reminding shopkeepers when their protection was due. These men did not need to shout. Their presence was enough. A glance, a name spoken aloud, a hand placed calmly on a countertop. They weren't just threats. They were symbols. Reminders that the streets had rules. Rules that didn't come from City Hall. In neighborhoods like the Lower East Side, Chinatown, Hell's Kitchen, and Little Italy, vice was often woven into daily life. Some buildings had apartments upstairs and card games below. A restaurant might serve a quiet family dinner on the main floor and host bets behind a curtain in the back. Policemen walked the same streets, passed the same doors. They saw the signs. Sometimes they looked away. Sometimes they stopped in. In many cases, they were part of the arrangement. A portion of the profits flowed upward, to captains, to officials, to men whose uniforms masked their connections. It was not hidden. It was simply understood. And for many who lived there, it was more dependable than the city's promises. Vice was not only a business, it was a way of keeping balance. When gambling was allowed to flourish, it pulled restless men away from the streets. When alcohol flowed, it softened tempers. When desires were quietly met, violence sometimes stayed at bay. The gangs understood this. They did not claim to make the world better, only quieter, predictable, easier to manage. Of course, the cost was high. Addiction, broken families, debt that never ended. Young men pulled into games that could not win. Women used, discarded, forgotten. Behind the polished clubs and tidy fronts were rooms filled with sorrow. But even those caught in the web often returned to it. Because in that world, someone always knew your name. Someone watched your back. And the cold silence of the law offered nothing in return. Some of the city's most powerful figures came from these rooms. They learned early how to manage people, how to speak without speaking, how to turn favors into loyalty. They built networks across boroughs. They understood that secrets could be more valuable than cash. They didn't always fight with fists. Sometimes they fought with silence. A business owner who refused to pay might find his supplies delayed, his building inspected, his name on a list. These were quiet punishments, but they left a mark. And yet, the line between criminal and protector was never fixed. In many neighborhoods, these men were the ones who stepped in when the police did not. They resolved disputes, lent money, made sure no one starved during the winter. Children learned to nod when they passed certain corners. Women knew which men to trust in a crisis. It was a strange kind of respect, not clean, not proud, but real. The system worked because everyone believed it worked. And when belief faded, when someone refused to pay or spoke to the wrong person, the whole balance could shift. A single act of defiance could start a chain. Fights, fires, arrests. But more often, the system held. Because it was old. Because it was familiar. Even the newspapers understood. They printed stories now and then. About corruption, about vice, about backroom deals. But most stories faded quickly. The readers knew. The writers knew. The police knew. And the men in charge knew how to keep the most dangerous secrets off the page. By the time Prohibition arrived, the system was ready. The networks were in place. The men were trained. The code was written. Vice would only grow. And protection would become more valuable than ever. But even before that new chapter, New York had already lived under the quiet rule of men who offered more than threats. They offered consistency, a kind of order, a way to make sense of a city that too often looked away from the needs of its poorest. They were not saints. They were not saviors. But for many, they were the only ones who answered the door when trouble came calling. And for that, the system endured. Chapter 10, The Women in the Shadows. They were rarely in the headlines. Their names didn't echo through courtrooms or appear on arrest records the way the gang leaders did. They weren't the ones walking in packs down the streets or facing off in alleyway brawls. But the women of New York's underworld were always there, watching, surviving, and shaping life in ways that mattered. In the gang world of the 19th and early 20th centuries, power was most often seen in male hands. Fists, clubs, orders shouted across rooftops. But behind those acts, there were other kinds of strength, quieter, steadier, and just as essential. Many of these women lived in the same tenements as their husbands, brothers, or sons. But their days began before sunrise and ended long after dark. They scrubbed floors, mended clothes, boiled water over low flames, and stretched small meals to feed many mouths. They stood in long lines for bread. They bargained at markets. And when trouble came knocking, they answered with calm eyes and steady voices. Some were wives of gang members, raising children while their partners disappeared for days or weeks at a time. They didn't ask questions, or if they did, they knew when not to expect answers. They patched up wounds without speaking. They kept secrets without writing them down. Others were mothers, watching sons drift into the streets, pulled by the promise of money, belonging, and fearsome pride. They prayed quietly. They hoped without saying it aloud. And sometimes they stepped in, begging a neighbor, pleading with a priest, or asking a rival for mercy on a boy too young to understand what he was joining. But not all women in the underworld were silent or passive. Some took on roles within the gangs themselves. They ran boarding houses where plans were made. They managed brothels that funneled money into gang operations. They passed messages, hid weapons, and sometimes negotiated peace between feuding factions. They knew how to speak without saying much, how to listen carefully, how to see what others missed. These women moved in and out of taverns with ease. They kept track of debts, of names, of shifting loyalties. They wore plain dresses and soft shoes, but their presence was felt. A glance from one of them could carry more weight than a threat from a younger man with a club. And then there were the women who earned their living on the edge of respectability. Dancers, performers, workers in the night trade. Their choices were limited, their risk constant. But many found their own kind of control within that dangerous space. Some formed close bonds with gang leaders, offering counsel and company. Others used the money they earned to support families, to send younger siblings to school, to carve out small pockets of stability in an unstable world. They were not helpless. They were navigating the same streets, facing the same dangers with far fewer protections. They wore thick skirts in winter and thin blouses in summer. They carried pins in their hair and knives in their bags. They walked alone when they had to, shoulders square, eyes forward, and they endured. The newspapers rarely mentioned them unless it was to scandalize, painting them as fallen women, temptresses, or tragic figures caught in the web of crime. But the truth was more complex. They were caretakers and hustlers, teachers and traders. Some were kind, some were cruel. Most were a little of both, depending on the day. They cleaned blood from floorboards. They smuggled notes and loaves of bread. They stood in courtrooms beside husbands who said nothing in their defense or everything at once with a glance. They faced judges who assumed too much and neighbors who understood more than they let on. Children watched them closely. Girls learned how to stitch a torn shirt, how to walk without looking afraid, how to speak firmly without raising a voice. Boys saw the strength in their mothers' backs, in the way they handled sorrow without complaint, in the way they moved through grief with grace and fury. And when the gang leaders fell, when they were arrested, or vanished, or died in quiet rooms, it was often the women who held what remained together. They managed the deaths. They buried the dead. They kept the children safe. In some families, the mothers had been through it all before. They had seen their own fathers pulled into fights, their brothers lost to drink or prison, and still they made soup from scraps. Still, they swept the stoop each morning. Some women over time stepped further into power. In neighborhoods where gang structures softened, women opened shops, started services, ran games, or managed protection rackets of their own, quietly, without banners or threats. Just a reputation and a steady hand. They were not always liked, but they were respected. Their work was mostly invisible to outsiders, but within their communities, they were known. If a baby was born, they came with blankets. If a fire took everything, they found shelter. If a husband disappeared, they helped with food. And if someone needed to be warned, they knew just what to say. They lived in the shadows not because they were weak, but because the shadows were safer, quieter, and better suited for work that didn't need applause. Their stories often went untold. Their faces disappeared from records. But in every block of old New York where a gang had once ruled, a woman had held the home together behind it. She may not have raised her voice, but she remembered every name. Chapter 11: The Thin Blue Line. In every great city, there is a boundary, not always made of walls or fences, but of people, those who stand between order and chaos, between the rule of law and the rules of the street. In New York, during the rise and fall of its old gangs, that boundary was known as the Thin Blue Line. The phrase referred to the police, the men in uniform who walked the beat, rang the bells, and blew their whistles. But in those years, the line was not always so firm, not always so clear. The New York City Police Department was still growing in those days, still learning what it meant to protect a city that changed by the hour. Founded in 1845, it was the first modern municipal police force in the United States. Its early members wore blue coats, rounded hats, and badges that looked more like coins than symbols of justice. They walked their assigned blocks with no cars, no radios, and few tools beyond a club and their presence. A single officer might patrol a stretch of dark alleys and winding streets for 10 or 12 hours. He knew the residents by name, at least the ones who stayed long enough. He knew who owned which shop, who lived in which tenement, who belonged to which gang. And more importantly, they knew him. Some officers tried their best. They showed up early. They stopped fights before they began. They calmed drunks. They comforted frightened families when arguments spilled into violence. They kept their eyes open, their heads low, and their hands steady. They did what they could, but others saw their uniforms as invitations to power and profit. Corruption in the force was no secret. It started small: a free drink, a friendly gift, a tip about a card game in exchange for looking the other way. Over time, those favors became habits, and habits became policy. A shop owner might pay a monthly fee to avoid inspections. A brothel might stay open so long as a portion of its earnings went into the right hands. Policemen assigned to certain neighborhoods often received extra money from ward bosses, gang leaders, or saloon owners. These payments were not always called bribes. They were simply expected. The system became so routine that it was rarely questioned. A policeman who refused the extra money might be reassigned, ignored, or quietly removed from his post. He might even find himself without support when real danger came calling. Higher up the ladder, the problems deepened. Captains and commissioners formed connections with political machines like Tammany Hall. Promotions were handed out not for courage, but for loyalty. Arrest could be arranged or prevented by a single phone call. Judges worked closely with precinct commanders. District attorneys learned when not to ask too many questions. The gangs understood this perfectly. They did not see the police as their enemies, but as another part of the city to be managed. A good relationship with a precinct captain could mean years of quiet business. A generous donation to a retirement fund could open doors, and when those efforts failed, threats could work just as well. It was a delicate balance. Some officers genuinely wanted to clean up the streets, but without support and facing both gang violence and pressure from within their own ranks, their efforts often went nowhere. There were moments of bravery. Patrolmen who stood alone in front of saloons to break up fights. Detectives who tracked down violent criminals across borough lines. sergeants who refused to be bought, who stayed on the job even when it brought them no thanks. Their stories were rarely told, but they mattered. Still, for much of the public, trust in the police was uncertain. In immigrant neighborhoods, many residents saw the officers as outsiders. They spoke different languages. They came from different worlds, and too often, their actions confirmed people's fears. Arrests were made without cause. Young men were beaten in alleys and left without explanation. Women who reported crimes were turned away or ignored. The uniform, meant to represent safety, became a symbol of power, not always fair and not always just. Yet the city kept growing. More officers were hired. New training methods were introduced. Patrol wagons replaced foot chases. Call boxes were installed on corners to improve communication. But the gap between law and the people it served remained wide. Into this space, reformers stepped. Journalists began to write about police abuse and gang connections. They printed names, told stories, exposed deals. Some newspapers sided with the city's wealthy, calling for harsher crackdowns. Others sided with the poor, calling for change in both law enforcement and the courts. Political pressure followed. New commissioners were appointed with promises of reform. Internal affairs units were created. Officers were required to report their income. Some high-ranking officials were arrested. Some retired quietly. And though the changes were slow, they began to take root. New recruits were tested more carefully. Community meetings were held. Uniforms changed. Laws were rewritten. But the shadow of the past remained. Even as the gangs began to fade from the streets, the stories lingered. People remembered which officers had helped and which had not. Children who had watched their fathers beaten without cause grew up with quiet anger. Shopkeepers who had paid bribes remembered each dollar, and those memories shaped how future generations would see the men in blue. In time, the thin blue line would thicken. It would become more formal, more present, more powerful. During the age of the old New York gangs, it was never entirely straight. It curved around politics. It bent under pressure. And sometimes it vanished altogether. Yet within that shifting space, some officers still walked with purpose. They did not shout. They did not take. They simply stood between the people and the chaos and did their best to hold the line. Chapter 12. The Great Decline. No empire lasts forever. Not even one built from back alleys, smoky rooms, and whispered deals. By the early decades of the 20th century, the gangs that had once ruled the streets of New York were beginning to fade. Their names still carried weight in certain neighborhoods, but their grip was loosening. The city was changing, and the old ways no longer worked as they once had. The decline did not happen all at once. It came gradually, like water wearing down stone. Some of the gang leaders aged out. Their strength faded. Their allies retired or died. Younger men looked elsewhere for opportunity, toward the growing world of organized crime, toward business ventures that offered more profit with less chaos. Others moved away altogether, pulled by promises of steady work in new cities or safer homes in rising suburbs. New York itself was evolving. The population had exploded. Buildings climbed higher. Subways ran beneath streets that had once been crossed on foot or by horse. Immigrants still arrived, but in even greater numbers, bringing with them different languages, customs, and hopes. The neighborhoods grew more crowded and also more complex. The police force had grown stronger, too. After years of pressure from reformers, politicians, and journalists, the department had become more professional. Training improved. Corruption, while not gone, was no longer openly accepted. Officers had radios. Patrols were more organized. The days when a single precinct captain could ignore gang activity for the right payment were slipping into the past. Political machines like Tammany Hall also began to weaken. Investigations uncovered years of bribes, embezzlement, and favoritism. New political leaders promised change, and while many promises fell short, Some reforms took hold. Elections were harder to manipulate. Newspapers were more willing to speak out, and the public had grown tired of the same names, the same stories. For the gangs, these changes meant fewer safe spaces. Saloon owners no longer welcomed them openly. Judges no longer turned a blind eye. Ward bosses, facing pressure of their own, stopped offering protection. Even local business owners began to speak out. Some joined new associations. Others hired private security. They wanted peace, and they were willing to push for it. Inside the gangs, tension rose. Without support from outside forces, internal fights became more common. Disagreements over money, loyalty, and leadership led to breakups. Splinter groups formed. Longtime allies became rivals. Some fights that once might have been settled with words now ended in gunfire. The city watched all this with a kind of quiet relief. To many New Yorkers, the old gangs had been a constant fear. Now, they were stories, still dangerous in places, but no longer in control. Children walked to school without checking who stood on the corner. Shopkeepers stopped hiding extra money behind their counters. The balance was shifting. Some former gang members tried to adjust. They opened businesses, often legitimate. Billiard halls, restaurants, small shops that sold newspapers or cigars. Others worked as bodyguards or security for private clients. A few found jobs in the movie business, consulting on scenes that showed the very streets they once ruled. But not everyone adapted. Some tried to hold on to power through force. They found themselves outnumbered, outgunned, or simply ignored. Arrests increased. Trials followed. Juries no longer looked the other way. Judges handed down longer sentences. The old network of favors had gone silent. The newspapers changed too. Where once gang wars filled the front pages, now the headlines focused on larger stories, economic shifts, political reforms, international news. The drama of gang life was replaced by quieter concerns. Housing laws, labor strikes, new technology. The city had new interests, and yet the memory of the gangs remained. Older residents still remembered the names. They could point to street corners and say, "That's where the Bowery boys fought the dead rabbits." They recalled the nights when doors were bolted and windows shuttered. The sound of boots running down alleyways. The strange silence that came after a fight ended. The legacy of the gangs lived on in other ways too. In some communities, their presence had left a kind of emptiness, a space where trust had been broken, where safety had never felt real. It took time to heal. It took years before some people truly believed that the rules had changed. In other places, the stories became part of neighborhood pride. Children heard tales from uncles and grandfathers about the old days, about fights won and lost, about honor, loyalty, and the strange rules of the streets. These stories were softened with time, polished like coins kept in a drawer. They became history, not memory. And slowly, the city buried its past. The old gang saloons closed. Buildings were torn down or rebuilt. Streets were renamed. New people moved in, unaware of what had come before. The traces faded. Only a few photographs remained, a few worn pages and forgotten books. But in the shape of the city, something remained. In the layout of certain neighborhoods, in the lines of old brick buildings, in the silence that still clung to some alleys after dark. A quiet reminder that once, not so long ago, the streets belonged to different voices. Voices that shouted, laughed, fought, and vanished. The gangs of old New York did not leave monuments, but they shaped the rhythm of the city, the way people moved, the way they watched, the way they learned to look twice before stepping into the street. And even as their time passed, they left behind a lesson. That power, no matter how loud, eventually fades. That fear, no matter how strong, gives way to change, and that even the hardest names, once spoken with dread, can become whispers in the wind. Chapter 13: Legacy of the Streets. When a thing ends, it does not vanish all at once. It lingers in memory, in habit, and the way a place carries itself after the noise is gone. The gangs of old New York, though no longer walking the streets in boots and broad hats, left their mark behind. Not only in headlines and court records, but in the very way the city grew up. It would be easy to believe they disappeared entirely. Easy to think that once the names faded from the news, the people who carried them were forgotten. But the truth is, their presence endured in quiet, ordinary ways. Some of the buildings that once hid backroom meetings became shops or housing or were replaced by taller, newer structures. But beneath their floors, deep in the basements and foundations, the bricks still remembered. Pipes once used to signal between rooms, doors once opened only with a special knock, were left untouched. Forgotten, perhaps, but still there. In the older neighborhoods, certain corners carried reputations that outlived the gangs themselves. People crossed the street without thinking why. They felt something, a kind of pressure, a hush. Maybe it was the shape of the buildings, maybe it was the way the wind moved, or maybe it was memory. Not personal, but shared. For those who had lived through those years, the vendors, the barbers, the school teachers, the parents, the stories stayed close. They told them in fragments. There used to be a club down that alley. This doorway was where they passed messages. That mark on the wall, it meant something. The details blurred with time, but the feeling remained. A city never truly forgets what shaped it, even when it grows beyond the hands that once held it. Some of the gang members who survived the years went on to quieter lives. They found work in shipping, in small businesses, in the growing world of taxis and repair shops. Some raised families. Some drank alone in dim bars, nodding when certain names were mentioned, but saying little. They had seen too much, and the city had moved on. Others left behind children who carried pieces of those years without fully knowing it. A certain way of walking down a street. A kind of caution in crowded rooms. A skill for reading people that came from long years of watching, listening, and waiting. And in time, the stories of the gangs changed. They were no longer warnings. They became tales told late at night. Bits of family history, local legends. In schoolyards, boys still argued over who would win in a fight, Monk Eastman or Paul Kelly, without truly knowing who they were. Their names were no longer feared. They had become characters, like something from a book left open on a dusty table. But not all legacies were light. The fear they created had shaped city policy for decades. Police patrols were increased in neighborhoods once ruled by gangs. Laws were written to control gatherings, to monitor organizations, to register weapons. Entire buildings were demolished not because they were unsafe, but because they were linked to crime. The gangs had also influenced how the city thought about power. Their rise had shown that control did not have to come from official offices or formal votes. It could come from reputation, from presence, from who people believed was in charge. That idea lingered. It shaped how some communities viewed leadership. It colored how trust was given or not given to the authorities. And in places where trust had been broken, it took generations to rebuild. Still, the city kept going. New York grew taller, faster, louder. Subways stretched across boroughs. Skyscrapers rose. People from new corners of the world arrived. With them came new challenges, new hopes, and sometimes new gangs. But those later groups were different, more hidden, more connected to global networks, less tied to the streets and more to numbers, to contracts, to hidden flows of money. They owed something to the old gangs, but their faces were harder to see. In contrast, the legacy of the old street gangs became something quieter. A memory carried in a photograph tucked into a family drawer. a name carved into a brick wall behind a boarded-up building. A word passed between old friends who had shared the same block 50 years ago. Writers found these stories and turned them into novels. Filmmakers gave them new life, sometimes with accuracy, sometimes with drama. The past became entertainment, but those who had lived it rarely saw it that way. For them, it had been survival. Still, there is something powerful about memory. When a man stands on a corner where his grandfather once stood, when he traces the line of a street that has changed but not disappeared, he feels something. A tug, a thread, a voice saying, "This was once yours," and it still remembers you. Cities are not just made of stone and steel. They are made of people, of moments, of quiet choices and loud mistakes. The gangs of old New York did not build the city in the way architects did, but they shaped its movement. They taught it to watch its back, to hold its secrets, to speak in signals. They were born from hunger, from need, from the failure of larger systems to care for the smallest lives. They were not born evil. They were born human. And in their rise and fall, they left behind lessons worth remembering. That people need belonging. That power, when unbalanced, always tilts toward control. And that even in the darkest corners, people search for some kind of order, whether by law or by loyalty or by the soft rules of the street. Today, tourists walk the old neighborhoods. They take pictures of buildings that have been rebuilt a dozen times. They sip coffee where saloons once stood. They look up at windows once shattered in riots and see only reflections. But beneath their feet, the city remembers. The rhythm of the street, the weight of footsteps, the silence that comes after something ends. Chapter 14: Myths and Realities. Time has a way of smoothing out sharp edges. The stories of New York's old gangs, once told in anger and fear, became over time something different, something quieter, more colorful, sometimes even noble. But beneath the surface of these stories, behind the polished words and dramatic retellings, lived something harder. The truth was still there. As the city moved on and memories grew older, people began to speak of the gangs not with dread, but with interest. They told stories over drinks, around kitchen tables, on walks through the neighborhoods where the old fights once took place. Details shifted slightly from person to person. Names were remembered differently. Events became larger, more dramatic, more cinematic. A knife fight became a duel. A street brawl became a war. A man with a club became a king of the underworld. It wasn't lying. It was remembering in a way that felt right. And so, the gangs passed into legend. Writers picked up the stories and added their own flourishes. They brought the dead rabbits and the Bowery boys back to life, gave Bill the Butcher sharper lines and a deeper purpose, turned Paul Kelly into a figure of charm and mystery. The rough lives of the street became the inspiration for books, plays, films. The most well-known of these stories came much later, shaped by Hollywood, wrapped in smoke and shadows, filled with careful lighting and perfect dialogue. These versions of the gangs looked different. They were played by actors with clean faces and tailored clothes. The streets were carefully recreated on sound stages. The violence was choreographed. The dirt was chosen to match the color of the scene. And people loved it. The audiences leaned in. They marveled at the energy, the danger, the sense of brotherhood and defiance. They saw gangs as something strange and exciting, full of passion, loyalty, and old-fashioned grit. They watched men rise and fall with pride, take revenge with purpose, and speak of honor among thieves. But the truth, for those who had lived it, was much quieter. The real streets were cold and wet. The boots had holes. The food was never enough. The fights were not moments of glory, but of fear. The men who led the gangs did not always speak like poets. They got tired. They got old. They made mistakes. And the people who followed them often paid the price. Children lost fathers. Mothers waited by doors that never opened again. Blood dried on stone and was swept away before dawn. Police turned their heads, then turned them back. It was not glamorous. It was not beautiful. It was just life, lived hard and short. Still, myths have power. They remind us of what people hoped for. Strength, loyalty, a name that meant something. They offer meaning where real life offered only survival. And in that way, even the myths carry some truth. Because the people who built those gangs were real. They were poor. They were angry. They were proud. They were trying to build something in a world that gave them little. They looked for safety in each other. They gave what they had, and they took what they could. And the city they shaped grew out of that struggle. The myths also served another purpose. They gave people distance. A way to look back without pain. A way to talk about the past without reopening old wounds. A man could say, "My grandfather knew a guy in the dead rabbits," and smile. He didn't have to say how close the danger once was. He didn't have to explain the bruises, the fear, the long nights when no one slept. So the stories grew. They were told in books with weathered covers, in films with sweeping soundtracks, in walking tours that stopped at corners where nothing remained of what once was. They were retold for new generations who had never known the taste of soot in the air or the sound of clubs striking cobblestone. And perhaps that is not wrong. Every city needs its legends. The danger, of course, is forgetting the cost. Forgetting the women who went hungry while their sons joined the gangs. Forgetting the children who flinched at every knock on the door. Forgetting the neighborhoods that lived in fear, not of strangers, but of the boys they once knew. The reality was not all violence either. There were moments of kindness, of laughter, of boys who turned away from the fight and chose something else. There were neighbors who stood between enemies, who shared food with those on the other side, who tried to hold peace in a place where it rarely lasted long. Those stories are harder to find. They are quieter, less exciting, but they are just as real. And perhaps they are even more important, because they remind us that beneath every myth is a person. Someone who stood in the rain with a torn coat. Someone who carried guilt in silence. Someone who wanted more, but didn't know how to get it. Someone who dreamed of a different life. The streets where the gangs once ruled are now filled with buses and bicycles. Cafes, bookstores, and apartment buildings rise where saloons once stood. But if you look closely, if you walk slowly enough, you may still feel it. Not fear, not danger, just something old. The quiet shape of a memory, the breath of a story passed from one hand to another. Not to scare, not to shame, but to remind that history is not made only by grand speeches and shining halls. Sometimes it is made in shadows, by people who tried, by people who failed, and by those who chose to remember, not just what happened, but why it mattered. Chapter 15, New York Remembers. Even as the last gang leader faded from the headlines, even as the city's buildings climbed higher and the streets grew louder, the memory of those early years never truly left. It settled in slowly, like dust between floorboards or names carved deep into stone behind a wall someone forgot to paint. New York does not hold on to its past in obvious ways. It replaces, it rebuilds, it rushes forward. But here and there, in the quiet spaces, you can still find what came before. On certain corners, if you pause long enough, you might hear a story. Not from the buildings themselves, but from the people. An old man sweeping his stoop. A shopkeeper folding newspapers. A grandmother carrying a bag of groceries up 3 flights of stairs. They may speak of back then without naming the year. They may mention a gang, not with fear, but with a certain softness, as if remembering a cousin or a neighbor or a name that once meant protection more than threat. New York remembers in layers. It remembers in the way a street bends unexpectedly, because long ago it followed the curve of a fence that no longer stands. It remembers in the shape of a stoop worn down by boots, some of them polished, some stained with blood. It remembers in the way a mother holds her child's hand tighter near an alley, even if she doesn't know why. And it remembers in silence, too. In buildings with bricked-over windows. In doors that never open. In names no longer spoken, but still written faintly beneath layers of paint. The stories of the city's gangs have passed from fact to folklore, from fear to fascination. They live in museums now, in glass cases beside worn leather gloves and rusted brass knuckles. They appear in books and films, cleaned up and written down, reshaped for new eyes. But outside those pages, the city still carries the weight of those years. The streets where they ruled did not vanish. They became something else. The 5 Points neighborhood, once filled with noise and struggle, became blocks of government buildings and apartment towers. Chinatown pressed against its edges. Little Italy moved in from the north. The boundaries changed, but the ground remained. Beneath the sidewalks, old bricks still rest. Sewers still follow the same lines. Shadows fall in the same places. The gangs that once ruled these blocks helped build what came after. By force, by accident, by need. They shaped the flow of power. They tested the limits of law. And they reminded a growing city what happens when people are left behind. Their legacy is not one of heroes, but it is human. They were born out of pain, out of hunger, out of the wide, hard silence that filled the spaces between what the city promised and what it gave. They found each other in that space. And for a time, they made a kind of sense in a world that did not. And now the streets are filled with different kinds of noise. Sirens, horns, conversations in every language on earth. The city has changed again and again. And yet, something of the past lingers. Not because people want it to return, but because forgetting it would be a kind of loss. We remember so we don't repeat. We remember so we can understand. We remember because someone must. The gang members are gone. The saloons, the fights, the crooked politicians, they all passed into history. But the questions they left behind remain. Who gets to feel safe? Who gets to belong? And who will step in when no one else will? New York has never been easy, but it has always been full of life, of fight, of people trying to make their way through crowded streets with too little space and too much noise. The gangs of the Gilded City were part of that journey. Not the best part, but a real part. And in the quiet corners of the city, under streetlights, beside stoops, in the spaces between scaffolding and stone, the stories are still there, waiting to be remembered, or simply felt